Welcome, dear listener, or reader, or occasional midnight scroller. Tonight, we begin a tale not of conquest or courtly romance, but of quiet decline, soft fabrics, and the slow unraveling of a very padded monarch. Our setting: England, early January, the year 1547. Our subject, King Henry VIII, once a strapping youth with legs envied across Europe. Now? Well, now, more of a horizontal sovereign, draped in silks and grievances. Please dim the lights. Perhaps find a blanket that smells faintly of clean laundry or forgotten lavender sachets. Let the hum of the world recede like retreating cavalry. We'll begin not with Henry's birth or his rise to power, but with something far more immediately relevant: the condition of his waistcoat. You see, by the winter of his 55th year, Henry was, how shall we put it, larger than the average sovereign. Much larger. His waist was estimated at over 50 inches, which in Tudor units was referred to simply as substantial. Tailors' brave souls that they were had long since stopped measuring with tape and had instead adopted the use of rope and gentle size. His last waistcoat, royal blue, brocaded with golden thistles and reinforced with nearly industrial strength, stitching was a marvel of fabric-based engineering. It had to be. The king's body, increasingly immobile, had become more of a structure than a figure. This waistcoat, incidentally, had its own padded shoulder rolls, which were less about fashion and more about structural necessity. They balanced the fabric so that the garment didn't collapse inward like a failed cathedral. Getting it on required a sequence of trained attendants, 2 wooden rods, and a generous application of beeswax to avoid chafing. Now, why are we beginning with clothing? Well, because that's how the day began for Henry, if you could call it a day. He no longer rose with the sun. The sun had learned not to expect him. Instead, he was roused gently around the hour when normal people had already finished their bread porridge. A team of gentlemen of the bedchamber would enter whispering phrases like, "Forgive us, your grace," and "May we begin the turning process." For you, see, turning. Henry was now a delicate operation involving 3 men, a series of pulleys, and a prayer that he didn't awaken mid-lift. When he did, he tended to bellow, not from rage, but because his leg wound a persistent, ulcerated remnant of a jousting accident had a rather spirited dislike for movement. It was this leg, in fact, that occupied most of the attention these days. The royal physicians had done their best, which, in Tudor terms, meant bleeding poultices made of things one shouldn't name near soup, and the liberal use of honey. The wound, however, had its own personality. It was moody, resistant to treatment, and occasionally leaked something that caused candles to flicker ominously. And yet, Henry endured, or more precisely, he remained. He didn't walk far, or at all, but he existed with a kind of sovereign stubbornness. His courtiers referred to him as indomitable. The kitchen staff used terms less flattering, but equally descriptive. This particular January morning, or perhaps afternoon, began with the usual procedures. The king was propped up against a bolster embroidered with his family crest, his eyes still adjusting to the muted grayness of the chamber. The fire had been stoked, the rushes changed, and a small dog named Quince was snoring at the foot of the bed, entirely unaware of royal decorum. "Fetch the waistcoat," said the groom of the robes. The waistcoat was fetched. It arrived on a velvet tray, folded neatly like a diplomatic offering. The attendants made the sign of the cross, not for religious reasons, but because last time the king had refused the waistcoat and opted instead to drape himself in 2 tablecloths and a curtain rod. Fashion, as ever, was subject to mood. This time, however, he allowed the garment to be applied. Slowly, carefully. The room held its breath. Now you might wonder what he did once dressed. Did he attend council meetings? Did he pace dramatically, issuing decrees? Not quite. The king sat, or reclined, or occasionally gestured toward a cold roast capon and said, "That." By now the kingdom largely ran without him. Important matters were whispered to his heir, presumptive the young and rather pale Prince Edward, while Henry focused his energies on more immediate concerns, namely, whether the candle smoke irritated his eyes, and why his leg had begun to smell like last Tuesday's fish. And yet, he was still the king. Even diminished, padded, and propped his presence filled the chamber. Literally, yes, but also in the way that royalty often does, by sheer expectation. The courtiers bowed just as deeply. The musicians played just as softly, and the cooks still pretended his favorite pies weren't slowly killing him, bite by delicious bite. Outside, the sky was the same color as old pewter. The Thames muttered softly to itself, clogged with ice floes and discarded eel skins. Inside, the fire crackled, the dog snored, and Henry blinked slowly, as if considering the nature of life monarchy and the merits of mutton broth. This dear listener was the beginning of the end, not in a dramatic sense, but in the slow, steady erosion that time favors. And as the king settled back into his cushions, waistcoat slightly askew, a single thought drifted through his mind. I believe I shall nap." And so he did. The nap, as it were, was less an indulgence and more a necessity. For Henry, slumber had become a daily migration into a realm less burdensome than wakefulness. His dreams, according to the royal physician, who maintained an enthusiastic interest in humors and their alignment, were said to reflect the imbalance of phlegm and melancholy in the king's aging frame. This diagnosis came as many Tudor diagnoses did after a brief inspection of the patient's fingernails and a very thoughtful stare into the fire. Regardless of its source, the sleep was deep and slow and filled with the kind of vague, flickering shapes one sees behind closed eyelids when one's foot is slightly numb and one's leg wound is wrapped in 6 layers of linen rosemary and medicinal hope. The room, meantime, had adjusted to the silence. Courtiers tread more softly than usual, speaking in tones so hushed they might as well have been mouthing apologies to the floorboards. The fire gave off a pleasant wood smoke smell, mingling only slightly with the less agreeable scent rising from the royal bandages. Even the small dog, Quince, usually a creature of low regard for royal rest, curled tightly at the king's feet and refrained from his usual performance of twitching and yipping in his sleep. It was, in short, the closest thing to peace the royal bedchamber had known in weeks. But peace, like all things in a palace, was temporary. It was interrupted softly, respectfully, but unmistakably by a knock. Not at the grand door. No. That was for visitors of rank. This knock came at the service door, narrow and half hidden, behind the tapestry of a hunting scene that had not been dusted since the last queen. The tapestry depicted a boar, or perhaps a very muscular pig, being pursued by 2 identically startled noblemen. No one ever commented on it. Behind it stood Master Treadwell, the royal chirurgeon, a man of no great charm, but considerable dedication to the idea that health could be extracted from discomfort. He was let in by a silent nod from the groom of the stool, who, like most in his position, had long since abandoned the illusion of privacy. Treadwell stepped in his bag of tools, clinking faintly, a sound that sent one young footman briefly pale, and approached the bed with the expression of a man preparing to trim a lion's mane while it naps. "Is he?" the chirurgeon whispered, to which the reply was a nod and a hand gesture that might have meant asleep, or maybe still smoldering from lunch. In either case, Treadwell took it as an invitation. He knelt beside the king's leg, that infamous limb, and began the slow unwrapping. It was an art form now, this ritual of unveiling. Layers of cloth poultices that had dried into gentle crackle paper, and the faint but ever-present scent of fermented vinegar and regret. The wound, once exposed, looked well. It looked no worse than it had yesterday, which in chirurgeon circles counted as mild improvement. Henry stirred. A twitch, a grunt, and then an unmistakable snore as deep and royal as a thundercloud wrapped in molasses. Encouraged, Treadwell leaned closer. He examined the edges, tested the temperature with the back of his hand, and made a noise in his throat that was neither approval nor dismay. The groom of the stool raised an eyebrow. "We're fortunate," Treadwell whispered. "The swelling has settled, or perhaps retreated in fear." No one laughed. Humor, like healing, was rarely invited into the royal chamber. "I shall apply the new salve," he added, "this one made from ox gall goose fat and an extract of bark soaked in church water." Again, no laughter. It was by the standards of Tudor medicine quite innovative. He smeared it gently, pressing down with the flat of a goose feather, a method favored not for its efficacy, but for its lack of protest from the patient. The king's snoring changed pitch, briefly, hovering on a note of uncertain discomfort, before resuming its slow, rhythmic timbre. Somewhere across the chamber, a log collapsed in the hearth with a sleepy sigh. Minutes passed. The application was completed. The leg rewrapped. Treadwell nodded, satisfied that he had for now maintained the status quo of infection. He turned to rise and bumped the tray. Not the waistcoat tray. That had been long since cleared. No, this was a small side tray, bearing what remained of the king's most recent infusion, a mug of warmed ale and a half-bitten comfit speckled with aniseed and royal saliva. The mug tipped. Ale trickled onto the rushes, and the sound, small but sharply distinct, cut through the room like a bishop's disapproval. Henry shifted. His eyes opened. One, then the other. They blinked once, twice, and then, like a cat awoken by the sound of a plate being scraped, he frowned. Why, he croaked his voice like gravel on parchment. "Do I smell ale?" The room froze. Treadwell straightened so fast he nearly dropped his feather. A most minor accident. "Your Majesty," he said with as much cheer as a man holding an ointment-soaked goose implement could muster. The floor was thirsty. Henry grunted, a sound between contempt and indigestion. "Did you touch the leg?" "Only gently, my liege, with great reverence and limited success." The king blinked again. Then, after a long moment, he exhaled through his nose the royal equivalent of forgiveness. "Bring me a capon," he said at last, voice returning to its usual grumble, and something less awake than you to read to me. At this, a page scuttled off. The rest of the chamber exhaled in unison. Treadwell bowed and quietly retreated toward the tapestry, leaving behind only a faint scent of bark salve and the slightly rumpled air of a man who had almost, but not quite, been yelled at. Outside, the sky remained politely gray. Within, the king shifted again, settling deeper into the cushions, his leg still throbbing in its hidden layers. But now his eyes stayed open, just enough to follow the dog as it adjusted itself and the door as it creaked slightly on its hinges. Someone was approaching. Someone carrying a tray. But not a tray of food. No, it was parchment and ink and something that looked suspiciously like a scroll. The king narrowed his eyes. Reading, he had said. And now it seemed reading had arrived. The scroll, as it turned out, was neither particularly urgent nor especially welcome, though it did carry the royal seal and a faint smell of damp vellum mixed with lavender oil, which someone in the scriptorium had clearly overused. The page, a pale youth named Merryweather, with one elbow permanently tucked against his ribs, as if bracing for sudden impact, approached with the cautious optimism of a clerk delivering news to a bear who had misplaced his honey. "Your Majesty," he intoned, holding the scroll out as if it were a newborn hedgehog. The matter of the Welsh tithes. A report from Lord Rees concerning sheep taxation and an outbreak of mildew in the grain stores of Yangadog. Henry blinked at the scroll, then at Merryweather, then back at the scroll, which had begun to curl slightly at the corners, as if aware of its reception. Mildew. Henry rasped the word, falling from his lips like a heavy plum. In Wales. Yes, Your Majesty. They say it is damp. Henry stared. The statement was not untrue. Wales, as everyone knew, was a country made primarily of hills, rain and long vowels, and they sent me this, he muttered in January. Merryweather nodded, unsure whether agreement was the correct approach, but unwilling to risk disagreement. The Chancellor suggested you might wish to comment, he added, about the sheep or the mildew. There was a silence, not heavy, but dense in the way fog is dense, filling the corners of the chamber and making the fire seem very far away. Then Henry sighed, a sound that made one tapestry sway slightly from the force of it. Unroll it, he said. Let us witness mildew in ink. Merryweather did gingerly and began to read. The scroll was long, painstakingly detailed. It listed weather conditions, sheep head counts, fluctuations in oat production, and the tragic tale of a barn collapse that resulted in the injury of 3 geese and a priest. Henry listened for exactly 4 sentences before his mind, like a tired spaniel, wandered elsewhere. His gaze drifted toward the fire where the logs had settled into a kind of glowing resignation. Quince had resumed his nap, twitching occasionally, as if dreaming of simpler times, perhaps a pheasant. The king's leg ached, as always, but it had become a sort of background hum in his awareness, like the ticking of a faraway clock or the persistent whisper of regret that accompanied the memory of wife number 2. The scroll droned on. Something about hay shortages and moral laxity among younger herdsmen. Henry's eyes narrowed, not from interest, but from effort. Reading by proxy, he had decided, was like chewing through bread pudding with someone else's jaw. At last, he raised a hand. Enough. Merriweather stopped mid-sentence somewhere between a ruined barley harvest and a suspected goat theft. Your Majesty? Burn it, Henry said. In the fire. No, in the bathtub. Of course, in the fire. The page hesitated. It is royal correspondence. So is half my digestion, but I don't frame it. Merriweather bowed and quietly rolled the scroll back up a process that took nearly as long as the reading. He placed it beside the hearth with a reverence normally reserved for relics or slightly overripe fruit. Henry leaned back, the cushions shifting to accommodate the movement with the sluggish grace of tired bread dough. Send word to Lord Rees, he murmured. Tell him to build a roof, dry his oats, and write me only when something catches fire or learns to sing. Yes, Your Majesty. Merriweather scribbled this onto a small parchment with a quill that squeaked slightly when turned sideways. The king, meanwhile, was staring into the middle distance, his mind drawn now not to whales or mildew, but to something stranger, a dream he half remembered from his earlier nap. There had been a hallway, or a garden, possibly both, a corridor of vines, thick and swaying, lit by torches that flickered without smoke. In the dream, he had walked, not shuffled or limped, but walked upright and certain. He had spoken, too, though he could not now remember the words. And someone had answered. A voice, familiar and impossible. A woman's voice. Merriweather, he said, blinking. Do you believe dreams mean anything? The page froze halfway through, blotting the ink. I am not trained in such matters, Your Majesty. Of course not, Henry muttered. You barely read aloud. He paused. But still, if one dreams of something pleasant something absurd. Is it nonsense? I suppose it depends. Meriwether said cautiously on how often one dreams of it. Henry grunted. He looked down at his hands, thick and liver-spotted, now the veins like pale roots beneath waxen skin. They had once drawn bows, thrown lances, caressed necks, and signed executions. Now they mostly trembled. "Fetch me ink," he said, "and parchment. I'll write myself." Meriwether's eyes widened slightly. "Your Majesty, go." The page went hurrying toward the side door where servants hovered like polite ghosts. Henry waited. The fire snapped. Outside, wind rattled the glass like a gossipy widow. And still the memory of that voice lingered, curling behind his ears like steam from an untouched teacup. When the ink arrived, it was thicker than usual, dark as treacle, smelling faintly of elderberry and smoke. The quill was white goose feather, stiff at the spine. The parchment smooth, suspiciously new. Henry adjusted himself with effort. The leg pulsed. The cushion sighed. And he began to write, not with flair, but with force, as if dragging each letter out of the past with a bent fishing hook. "To whomever receives this," he scrawled, "I dreamt of you." He paused. Ink blotched, slightly pooling at the bottom of the Y. "You were not dead." Another pause, nor angry. He stared at the sentence, unsure if it was true. "You were walking ahead." I followed. The quill scratched. "You turned." I woke. A blot. A curse. He crumpled that sheet, reached for another. "Your voice," he tried again, "like music in a dry church." He scratched it out, started again. By the fifth attempt, the fire was nearly out. The dog had shifted twice, and the door, the heavy oak one, creaked slowly open. Henry did not look up. He simply dipped the quill once more and whispered, "Say it again." The door hadn't been touched, at least not by human hands, that anyone in the chamber noticed. It simply eased inward, its hinges, groaning with the weight of years and mild disapproval. The draft that followed was subtle but insistent, curling around the king's writing desk with the delicacy of a cautious housemaid lifting the corner of his unfinished letter just enough to make the ink ripple as it dried. Henry didn't look up right away. His eyes remained fixed on the last word he'd written, which after several abortive starts and one unfortunate quill splatter was remember. A simple word, but lately a heavy one. It had taken him longer than expected to spell it, not because he'd forgotten how, but because every letter had begun to resemble something else, a face, a crest, a signature on a treaty, long since voided. He placed the quill down gently, as if afraid it might protest, and finally raised his eyes. No one stood in the doorway. There was no footman, no page with unfortunate timing, no physician waving a cloth soaked in vinegar and optimism. And yet the door remained ajar, swaying slightly, in a rhythm that didn't match the wind outside. Henry blinked. Once, then, twice, as if polishing his vision from the inside. "Who leaves a door open?" he muttered. Not quite a question. He leaned back, his chair, creaking beneath the combined weight of velvet history and stubbornness. The fire behind him had sunk into a bed of coals, casting the room into a soft, muddled twilight. Shadows lengthened. The edges of furniture began to blur. He shifted in place and immediately regretted it. The leg sent a sharp reminder of its continued loyalty to pain, and he grunted more in ritual than reaction. "Merryweather," he called. "Fetch the latch. The cold has teeth." But there was no reply. No scampering of nervous shoes. No breathless apology, muffled by parchment. Only the steady, almost respectful hush of a wind that wasn't quite wind, and the gentle sway of a door that no one had touched. The king inhaled through his nose, the air tinged with ash wool, and something else. Something faintly floral, like the ghost of rosemary in a winter garden. It wasn't the usual scent of ointment or beeswax, or the lavender sachets stuffed in the tapestries to confuse moths and courtiers alike. It was sharper, older, familiar in a way that tugged the back of his throat. Slowly, Henry pushed himself upright. This took time. The process involved 3 cushions, a strained grunt, and an audible pop from somewhere in his lower back that sounded like a cork deciding to leave a bottle out of sheer boredom. He didn't rise fully standing, was no longer a common occurrence. But he leaned forward just enough to see past the edge of the hearth and toward the half-open door. And there, briefly framed in the flickering light, was a shape. Not a shadow, not a servant, a woman. Or at least the idea of a woman, as if someone had painted the memory of one and left it leaning against the corridor's far wall. She wore nothing grand, no jewels or furs or even the high linen collars that he remembered tugging at in impatience during long ceremonies. Just a simple gown, gray, or perhaps pale blue, hard to tell in the uncertain light. Her hair was bound up, but loosely, as though the task had been done in haste or by someone else. She did not speak. She simply stood, the hem of her dress slightly lifted by the same wind that had defied the latch, her hands folded in front of her, as if waiting for a verdict she already knew. Henry stared. His fingers twitched, brushing the edge of the desk. "You're not real?" he said, mostly to the fireplace. The woman did not reply, but she did move just a step, just enough for her profile to catch the last flare of an ember. She looked neither surprised nor solemn, just present, entirely, quietly present. And her eyes, if eyes, they were settled on him with the soft weight of long familiarity. "You're not her," he said again, louder this time, as if volume might force the air back into its proper shape. Still, no answer. But now she turned not to flee, but to walk slowly, as though guiding him through a hallway that no longer existed. The corridor behind her stretched on, lined with tapestries he barely remembered commissioning. One bore a stag, another a garden. He knew them once, but now they blended into the dark like memories half recalled after wine. "Wait," he said, rising an inch further. "I dreamed this." The woman paused. Not in obedience, not even in response, but in rhythm, like a dance remembered across a sea. Henry took a breath. The pain in his leg grew, but not sharply, more like a toothache than a dagger. His left hand gripped the edge of the desk, the right still faintly stained with ink. "Speak," he said, and for the first time in days, his voice held the old authority, the echo of halls that once bent to its command. And then, so faintly, he wasn't sure it came from her at all. Came a sound, a syllable, not a name, not a word, a sigh, a vowel folded into breath. He froze. The air shifted. Behind him, the fire hissed as a log collapsed inward, releasing a puff of smoke that coiled toward the ceiling and disappeared into the timbers. He turned back, but the corridor was empty. The woman, or the shape of her, was gone. The door remained open, swaying gently in a breeze that had lost its urgency. And still, that faint scent lingered. Rosemary, ink, old lace. Henry sank back into his chair without ceremony. The ink pot trembled as he leaned across the desk. His hand hovered over the parchment. "I dreamed this," he wrote again. Then, "But now I am awake." He stared at the words, crossed them out. "Or perhaps not," he added. "Perhaps the dream continues, but with my eyes open." He set the quill down, not because he was finished, but because the words had stopped forming. Somewhere outside the window, a night bird called once, then again, then silence. The king closed his eyes, not to sleep, not yet. but to remember a voice he had not heard in 30 years. The fire behind him breathed softly, and in the stillness that followed a second door, one hidden behind a bookshelf, clicked open as if invited. The second door was not part of the original blueprints of Whitehall. Not that anyone still alive had seen them. It was tucked behind a bookshelf that held volumes unread and unrequested for at least a decade, thick spine, cracked tomes of legal theory, alchemical optimism, and sermons written in Latin, so dense they might as well have been carved from limestone. The door itself bore no handle on the outside, only a small iron ring that had once been mistaken for an old hinge and ignored accordingly. Now it creaked open of its own volition, or perhaps nudged by a memory, or by whatever force had brought the woman to the corridor. Henry did not startle. He simply turned his head slowly, more out of habit than curiosity. Things opened around him these days. Curtains, letters, wounds. Another door was just one more thing, but this one. This particular door stirred something beneath the layers of age and indulgence, something that had not rustled in years. A distant awareness, like recalling a melody heard in youth and long since forgotten. He narrowed his eyes, the flesh around them sagging slightly, as if the very act of focus now required its own muscle group. The opening beyond the door was dark, but not entirely. A faint light pulsed within, warm, uneven, like candlelight seen through a fogged window. The air that emerged carried a smell that was not the usual assortment of chamber pot wool and barely burnt oak. It smelled of beeswax thyme and the curious crispness of iron keys. He leaned forward, wincing as his joints voiced their collective displeasure. "Merryweather," he called out of habit. No reply. The page had either fled, dozed off in a cupboard, or been entirely consumed by the corridors of royal duty. Henry considered the parchment still resting beneath his palm. He tapped it once, as if testing its reality. Then, with a grunt, he pushed his chair back, not far, not fast, but enough to allow him to pivot his considerable weight toward the open passage. His left foot found the ground first, followed by a pause, then the cautious extension of the wounded leg, which protested with the slow fury of a kettle brought to boil. He braced both hands against the arms of the chair and pushed. There was a sound like old rope stretching. A breath hissed between clenched teeth. Then, somehow, he stood. Crooked? Yes. Bent, certainly. But standing. The dog, Quince, opened one eye and then immediately closed it again, sensing no biscuits would be involved. The fire continued its quiet consumption of what little wood remained, and Henry, one step at a time, moved toward the bookshelf. The air grew cooler with each pace, not unpleasantly so, but distinctly different from the musty warmth of his chamber. As he crossed the threshold, he felt it not wind exactly, but a shift in pressure, as though the room beyond had been sealed from time, and only now remembered how to breathe. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for his frame, and lined with old stone, older than Whitehall itself, perhaps older than any Tudor memory. The walls bore shallow grooves, as if once smoothed by many hands, or carved in haste during some long-forgotten renovation. At regular intervals, small niches held candles, each flickering with a steady, silent flame. They did not sputter. They did not drip. They simply burned, as if unaware of the laws that governed normal wax and wick. Henry moved slowly, each footfall cushioned by dust and old rushes. The corridor curved gently, bending not in angles, but in soft spirals that suggested a deliberate, almost ceremonial design. He followed it without hesitation, not because he understood where it led, but because his body had made the decision already. Some part of him recognized this path, not in geography, but in rhythm. It felt like returning to a place once visited in a dream, or described to him in his cradle by a nursemaid, with too much wine and too few boundaries. After a time, he could not have said how long the corridor opened into a chamber. Small, circular, domed above, like the inside of a goblet. The walls were stone, but smoother now, covered in faded frescoes of plants and animals, some identifiable, some curiously invented. A fox with wings. A stag with two shadows. A heron bending toward a mirror. In the center of the room stood a pedestal waist-high and made of wood, so polished it glowed. Upon it rested a single object, a key. Henry stared at it. The key was large, too large for any chest or lock he could remember, and forged from metal, darker than iron, almost blue. Its teeth were oddly shaped, one straight, one jagged, one curved like a question mark. The handle bore an engraving, though the light was too dim to decipher it fully. He stepped closer. His knee crackled. The key did not move. It simply waited. With great care, he reached out and touched it. It was warm, not just from the candlelight, warm with the kind of heat that feels older than flame, like a hearth that remembers every winter. He closed his fingers around it. As he did, something shifted behind him, a click, soft but definite. He turned slowly, expecting a servant, a draft, or perhaps nothing at all. But the corridor had vanished. In its place was a mirror, oval rimmed in tarnished gold and as tall as a man. It had not been there before. He was certain of it. Yet now it stood framed by vines that seemed to grow directly from the stone. The glass itself was not clear, but clouded like pond water stirred by a cautious toe. And within it, barely visible, a shape moved. A woman again. The same from before. Or was she? The figure was turned away, walking through a garden path lined with rosemary, her hands trailing across the tops of hedges. She moved slowly, as if waiting to be followed. Henry clutched the key tighter. The mirror pulsed once, then held still. He stepped toward it, his reflection absent, replaced only by the shifting garden scene and the soft sound. Yes, now there was sound of distant bird song and water and something else beneath it, all the low hum of something opening. Behind the mirror, a crack in the wall began to widen. The crack widened without haste, as though time itself had finally found the courage to tug at a seam it had long suspected was loose. From behind the mirror, the wall split along a hairline fracture that ran upward and curled slightly to the left, revealing not rubble or masonry dust, but something entirely inappropriate for an interior wall ivy. Real ivy, green and glossy, despite the season, wound its way into the chamber as if it had been waiting just behind the stone for centuries. The scent changed immediately. The dry air of the hidden room filled now with the earthy sweetness of wet leaves loam and the vague memory of rainfall on limestone. Henry took a step back, not in fear precisely, but in the slow, automatic retreat of a man whose expectations had just folded into themselves like a badly baked pea. The ivy continued its advance, spiraling inward along the edge of the mirror, framing it until the entire glass surface was haloed in green. Then the image within it shimmered, not like water, but like silk stirred by breath, and the woman reappeared. She stood now beneath an arbor heavy with white blooms, the kind that droop slightly under their own fragrance. Her back was still turned, but she paused, tilting her head as if listening for something behind her, or someone. Henry felt the key in his hand grow slightly warmer. It hadn't changed shape, hadn't pulsed, or sparked, or performed any of the more theatrical behaviors expected of magical relics in folklore. But it felt different now, heavier, not in weight, but in presence, as if holding it was not merely possession, but participation. The mirror's glass softened further, losing its reflective quality, until it resembled an open archway wide enough to step through if one were inclined to step through such things, which, generally speaking, kings were not. But Henry had never been especially good at following advice meant for his safety. He stepped closer. The chamber around him held its breath. The candles did not flicker, but their light dimmed the way eyes narrow in the presence of something intimate. The mirror emitted no hum, no glow, no theatrical sound cue. It merely waited, open now, framed in ivy, and filled with a garden that logic suggested could not exist. Henry reached out, not tentatively, but not boldly either. His fingers passed through the surface with the softness of silk sliding past skin. There was no resistance, only temperature, like stepping from a cold stone room into the warmth of spring sunlight. He drew back once, as if to check his hand still belonged to him, then inhaled deeply. The leg pulsed once sharply, but not enough to deter him. And then, without ceremony, without proclamation, without even a final grunt, the king stepped through the mirror. The sensation was not travel. It was rearrangement. He found himself on a path paved in pale stones, warm underfoot, and set in a pattern that made no architectural sense, but felt right anyway. Like a dream. One forgets the moment they wake, only to recall later in fragments during tea. The garden stretched out before him, not manicured like the royal hedges of Hampton Court, but wild in an intentional way. Trees bent toward one another like gossiping nuns. Bushes bloomed with flowers of uncertain names and nostalgic colors. The air was thick with bird calls he couldn't identify, but somehow recognized. And ahead, of course, was the woman. She had not moved far, only to a bench made of what looked like interwoven branches, and the kind of patience one usually finds only in ancient furniture or very elderly cats. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, posture relaxed, neither waiting nor dismissive. Henry approached slowly, aware of each step, as though relearning the art of motion. His leg ached. Yes, but distantly, like a memory of pain, rather than the thing itself. When he reached her, he did not speak. Instead, he lowered himself onto the bench beside her with the deliberate slowness of someone stacking fragile plates. The bench held. The ivy around it rustled gently, although there was no wind. The woman turned her head, not fully, just enough for him to see the curve of her cheek, the faint smile at the corner of her mouth, the hair now slightly undone in a way that spoke of long walks and light laughter. "You found it," she said, not as a question. Her voice was the same as in the dream, though now it carried a weight not of sadness or joy, but of completeness, like the final note of a chord resolving after a pause. Henry nodded. "It opened," he replied, as if that explained anything. She glanced at the key still clenched in his hand. "That one always does." "For you?" He looked at her, then fully, as if trying to connect every piece of this memory to the woman beside him. She was older than the image in his mind, though not aged. Time had moved over her gently, like fingers smoothing linen. Her eyes were clear, her expression calm, but not serene in the way of saints or statues. She looked real, real in a way few people ever managed to be. "Am I dreaming?" he asked. She considered. "You might be. But I walked here. That doesn't mean you're awake." They sat in silence. The garden pulsed around them, not literally, but with a rhythm that suggested it was listening. Flowers tilted toward their feet. A bee circled lazily and decided they were not of interest. "You died," he said, after a while. "Years ago." She smiled. "So did you." "Almost." He blinked, but did not contest it. "What is this place?" She looked around. "A memory, I think, or a possibility, or a kindness. For me. Not just you." She stood then, slowly, her hands brushing her skirts into place. The fabric shimmered, not with magic, but with the kind of light that clings to things not entirely of one world. "Come," she said, offering him a hand. "There's something I'd like you to see." Henry hesitated. He glanced back. The path behind him was still there, the bench, the entrance, but no mirror, no stone chamber, no pedestal, just garden, just now. He took her hand. It was warm, the same warmth as the key, which he now realized was no longer in his hand, but in his pocket, or perhaps his heart. He didn't look. He only walked slowly, one foot before the other, beside the woman who had lived in his memory so long she had become part of the architecture of his silence. They turned a corner in the path where the bushes gave way to an opening, and beyond that, not sky, but a structure. Familiar, wrong, waiting. The structure ahead stood quietly in the open, neither grand nor humble. Its form somewhere between chapel and conservatory, though it bore no cross nor climbing roses. It looked not recently built, but gently grown. Its wooden beams curved like branches, still remembering how to bend, and its windows arched in a manner that suggested light had a personal invitation to come and go as it pleased. The roof was tiled in small, overlapping panels, that shimmered slightly, not because they were jeweled or enchanted, but because they had been polished over years by nothing more than wind time and whatever passed for attention in this place. Henry approached it without comment. The woman walked beside him, hands clasped loosely at her waist, not guiding exactly, but present in the way a path is present, constant, inevitable, quietly directional. As they neared, he noticed the door. It had no lock, no visible handle, only a surface smoothed by use and age, and a single symbol carved into its center, a spiral, like a snail shell, or a distant galaxy drawn with a single finger in wet clay. The moment they reached the threshold, the door opened inward with a sound so soft it was more memory than motion. Inside, the light changed. It was still daylight of some variety, but filtered through panes of glass that were neither clear nor colored, only gently clouded, like morning mist caught between layers of silence. The room within was round, though not perfectly so. There were cushions, not chairs. Low tables, some holding small bowls of polished stones, others with quills resting beside sheets of blank parchment that curled faintly at the corners, as though sighing in anticipation. The woman gestured gently, and Henry entered. The air was warm, not stifling, but settled. It smelled of wax old wood, and something lightly citrus, like lemon balm, left too close to a candle. He did not speak, and neither did she. Not at first. She crossed the space to one of the tables and picked up a small object, a locket, or perhaps a miniature compass, something that clicked once when opened and showed no reflection when aimed at the light. She turned it over in her palm twice, then set it back down with care. Henry remained near the doorway, his body still registering the weight of his own presence. "This place," he said finally, "it shouldn't exist." "Most things don't," she replied without turning. "Until they do." He nodded, though the logic didn't comfort him. His gaze shifted across the room. There were no portraits, no banners, no tapestries shouting of lineage or conquest. Yet somehow it felt familiar, not like a room he had visited, but like one he had once promised to build and never did. He took a few steps further, the sound of his footfalls muffled by thick woven mats that bore patterns too intricate to be accidental and too abstract to be remembered. He paused beside a small shelf that held 3 books. Only 3. Their titles were in no language he recognized, or perhaps they had none at all. He reached for one, but stopped just short of touching it. The woman turned, then facing him fully. "You've carried more than most," she said, "and longer than most were meant to. He raised an eyebrow. "I've carried a kingdom." "You carried your shadow," she said gently. "The kingdom carried itself." That silenced him more than he expected. He had been used to critics, to flatterers, to men who disguised resentment in the folds of their bows. But this was neither judgment nor praise. It was observation spoken in the tone one might use to describe a stubborn flower growing from the crack of a stone bridge. He let his hand fall away from the shelf and instead turned toward the center of the room, where a round basin sat atop a pedestal, not unlike the one in the chamber behind the mirror. The basin was filled with water, or something that passed for water. Its surface did not reflect his face. Only the ceiling above which he now noticed bore a mural of the night sky, stars arranged not in constellations, but in words. Words in no language he could name, but that made him want to close his eyes and listen. "What is this?" he asked, gesturing toward the basin. The woman joined him, her footsteps so quiet they might have been thoughts. "This is what you set aside," she said. "What you never said, and what was never said to you. It collects here." He frowned. Unspoken words. She nodded. And choices never made. Doors never opened. Questions never dared. He stared into the basin, trying to see something more than sky. The surface rippled once, then settled. Slowly, faintly, an image appeared, not sharp, but soft-edged, like a painting on damp parchment. A hallway, a young man in red and gold sword at his side, his face smooth, his brow uncreased by doubt. Henry recognized it. Himself, perhaps 19, pacing before a door he never entered. "I remember that day," he said. "I was going to speak to her, to ask." He trailed off. The woman nodded. "But you turned back." He looked at her. "And so it ended. So it never began," she replied. He turned back to the basin. The image changed. A battlefield now, or rather, the edge of one. A tent, a letter unsigned, a servant holding it waiting for a seal that never came. "That campaign," Henry murmured. "They told me to stay, that I was too ill, and I wanted to go." He paused. "But I didn't. And so someone else died," she said, not accusing, not even sorrowful, just placing the pieces back on the board. The basin rippled again. Now it showed a chamber, not unlike his own, but filled with light, filled with laughter. Children, perhaps, or shadows of them. A feast not held. A marriage not chosen. A name not spoken. Henry looked away. The key in his pocket seemed to grow heavier again. "Why show me this?" he asked. "What does it matter now?" "Because not all endings end," she said. "Some pause. Some wait." He met her eyes then. "For what?" "For someone to look," she said. "Really look." And just then, before he could ask what that meant or what he was meant to see, next, the wall behind the basin began to glow, not brightly, but like light from beneath a heavy curtain. A shape began to appear, large and smooth, as though a doorway were being drawn from the stone itself, not carved, not opened, drawn. The woman did not move, but her gaze shifted toward it. Henry turned as well, his breath catching slightly, not from fear, but from the recognition that something waited beyond that light, and that the act of walking through it might require more than legs. The doorway formed slowly, not with the suddenness of falling stone or the drama of creaking hinges, but with the gradual assurance of ink seeping into paper, as though the wall had simply remembered it was once an entrance and decided to resume its purpose. The light outlining it was pale, soft, and steady, with the quality of dawn peeking under a curtain rather than the flash of torches or divine intervention. It cast no harsh shadows, only a suggestion of movement, shapes behind the threshold, shifting as if brushing past gauze. Henry stood motionless, his breathing shallow, not out of fear, but because some ancient reflex in his body told him this moment required stillness, as though motion might disturb something sacred or delicate or waiting. The woman beside him remained composed, her hands now folded neatly before her, her expression unreadable, not because it was hidden, but because it held too many things at once: memory, kindness, resignation, and a trace of the quiet amusement that sometimes lives at the corner of truth. "You may pass through," she said softly, her voice no louder than a breeze. Henry glanced at her eyes, narrowing slightly. "What is it?" he asked. "A future." "A listening," she replied. "Not quite a future, not quite a past. A place where things not yet said might be heard. By whom? By what you left behind." He didn't move. The words didn't frighten him, not exactly, but they pressed against something inside his ribs, a space not usually touched. "Why now?" he asked, and his voice sounded tired, even to himself. "Why not years ago? Why not when I could have done something?" She smiled a smile so faint it might have been imagined. "Because only now do you want to listen more than you want to be heard." He turned back toward the glowing doorway. It had stopped changing, now fully formed a tall archway with no door, no barrier, only light, and that subtle shimmer of movement just beyond. The air was still. The weight of his leg felt distant, less like pain, and more like memory. His shoulders, burdened for so long with velvet and title, felt exposed in a way he hadn't known possible. The key in his pocket grew warmer, as though urging, not demanding. He stepped forward. 1 step, 2. Each movement was a negotiation between caution and impulse. The stone beneath his feet gave no protest, no creak or complaint. When he reached the threshold, he paused, not because he doubted, but because part of him had begun to remember. Not names, not dates, not decisions, but moments. The sound of a door closing softly at night, the weight of a letter sealed and never sent, a laugh in a corridor that never belonged to him, the way light looks when someone you love walks out of it. "What will I find?" he asked. "Only what was always there," she said, "but seen differently." That was enough. He stepped through. The sensation was not dramatic. There was no dizzying shift, no rupture of perspective, no rearrangement of senses. It was more like walking into a room, just slightly warmer than the last, a room with a familiar smell you can't place until you realize it's from your childhood. The space beyond was neither vast nor small, neither bright nor dim. It simply was. A long hallway stretched ahead, lined with doors, hundreds, perhaps thousands, each distinct in shape, size, and material. Some were made of polished oak, others of rough stone, some painted in faded colors, others etched with symbols he almost recognized. A few stood ajar, others tightly closed. Some bore no handles at all, only indentations where hands might once have rested. Henry stood at the beginning of this hallway, the echo of his footfall, the only sound. Behind him, the archway remained open, the light steady. The woman had not followed, or perhaps she had never needed to. He took a breath and moved forward, drawn not by purpose, but by the sensation of being gently pulled, as if each door hummed faintly with its own gravity. He paused at the first one, tall, narrow, painted a soft blue, with a single brass knob, shaped like a lion's head. He reached for it, but the moment his fingers touched the metal, a voice filled the air, not from behind the door, not from within, but from somewhere around him, soft as breath. "You were kind once, even when you thought no one saw it." Henry blinked. The voice was familiar, female, but he could not place it. The lion's head turned warm in his hand, then cool again. He stepped back. The next door was shorter, squat, made of stone, with a crack running down the middle. No knob. He placed his palm against it, and another voice spoke. You believed you were unloved because you loved poorly. He pulled his hand away quickly. The door did not open, but the crack glowed faintly for a moment before fading. He moved on. Door after door, voice after voice, not accusations, not praise, but fragments of what had been left unsaid in his lifetime. Thoughts never voiced, apologies never offered understanding, never sought. They came in many tones, a father's sternness tempered by pride, a servant's silent forgiveness, a wife's disappointed hope, a child's admiration buried beneath fear. And through it all, Henry did not cry. Not because he was unmoved, but because tears seemed too large a response for such quiet truths. Instead, he listened deeply, as though each door were a note in a song he had been trying to remember his entire life. He lost track of time, if time existed here. The hallway curved subtly, its floor smooth and clean worn, not by feet, but by the gravity of thought. Eventually, he reached a door unlike the others. It was simple, wood, unpainted, slightly uneven, as if built by an unskilled hand with great care. No knob, no carving, just a faint outline of a heart, not drawn, but impressed, as if someone had leaned into the wood long ago and left behind a shape of themselves. Henry reached out and placed both hands on the door. No voice came. Only silence. Deep. Unmoving. Present. And then, from the other side, a knock, not loud, not demanding, just one knock, soft and steady. Henry did not flinch. He closed his eyes, and the door slowly began to open inward. The door opened inward with the sound of old wood sighing, not from disuse, but from familiarity, like a breath taken just before a long-awaited conversation. The space revealed beyond was modest, not grand in size or decoration, but immediately full in presence. It was a room suspended in stillness, lit by a warm, indirect glow that had no obvious source, yet filled every corner without casting harsh shadows. The walls were neither stone nor plaster, but something in between, textured like parchment, and colored the shade of dry leaves in late autumn. The scent inside was difficult to place, but faintly reminiscent of dried lavender, warm bread, and the sort of dust that settles only where peace has lingered undisturbed. Henry stood at the threshold, his hand still resting on the edge of the open door, fingers tracing the grain of the wood, without thought. There was no sound beyond his own quiet breath, and even that seemed softened here, as if the room itself respected the weight of stillness. He stepped inside slowly. The floor was made of wooden planks, each with a unique pattern of knots and swirls, polished smooth by time rather than varnish. In the center of the room sat a single table, round and plain, flanked by 2 chairs that did not match. One was high-backed, with arms and a worn cushion of faded green velvet. The other was simpler, almost childlike, with no adornment, save for a small chip in the leg and a groove across the top rail, as if someone had idly run a blade along it during a long story. Henry paused near the table, not yet choosing a seat. He scanned the room. Along the far wall was a shelf, low and sturdy, holding a handful of objects. A clay cup, cracked but whole. A folded cloth with a faint floral pattern. A book with no title, and a ribbon marking the middle page. And a single shoe, small as if once worn by someone learning to walk. He said nothing. Instead, he moved to the shelf and touched the edge of the cup. It was cool to the touch, heavier than it looked. His thumb traced the crack that spiraled just below the rim. He could not remember where he had seen it before, but he knew it wasn't new. The cloth, too, sparked a sense of familiarity, not vivid or precise, but the kind of quiet comfort that comes from objects handled long ago in silence. He did not touch the shoe. It felt like it belonged to a moment that had once existed with great intensity, and then quietly dissolved into the fabric of forgotten afternoons. He turned back toward the table. The high-backed chair seemed too grand, too assertive. Without fully deciding, he lowered himself into the simpler one. It creaked under his weight, not in protest, but in acknowledgement, as if it had been waiting all along. He folded his hands on the table and let the silence settle around him. Across from him, the other chair remained empty cushion, slightly indented, as though someone had risen from it just a few moments before. He did not speak aloud, but a thought rose in him, like steam from a still pond. Who used to sit there? And why do I feel like I never asked? The room answered with a feeling rather than a sound, a sort of warmth across his chest, as if remembering the way someone used to lean toward him while speaking, not to instruct or persuade, but simply to be near. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, images began to surface, not full memories, but fragments. A hallway echoing with laughter that faded before it reached him. A meal eaten in silence, because the wrong thing had been said earlier. and no one wanted to unsay it. A letter, started then crumpled, because the apology no longer seemed enough. He opened his eyes. The book on the shelf was now slightly ajar, as if someone had turned a page. He hadn't heard it. He rose and crossed the room again, drawn by the subtle pull of the ribbon marker. He lifted the cover, careful not to disturb the rest of the shelf, and read the page it opened to. There were no words, only a simple drawing in faded ink, a path through a forest, two figures walking side by side, one tall, one smaller, neither looking at the other, but both facing the same direction. Beneath it, in tiny script, almost too faint to see, were 5 words. You were never walking alone. Henry closed the book gently and returned it to the shelf. The air shifted, then not a breeze, not even a draft, but the kind of quiet change one feels when someone enters a room behind you without speaking. He turned. The other chair was no longer empty. A figure sat there, now back straight, hands folded neatly on the lap, face still blurred by the half-light. No features were visible, only the clear outline of presence. Familiar, patient, entirely still. Henry did not speak. Neither did the figure. They sat across from each other in silence that did not demand explanation. After a moment, the figure reached across the table, not to grab or gesture, but simply to rest a hand beside his palm. Down fingers relaxed. Henry looked at the hand, then his own. He raised his fingers slightly, then paused, then gently set them beside the other, not touching, but close enough that the warmth could be felt. The table between them seemed to breathe the wood, stretching with invisible life. He exhaled slowly. The pain in his leg was absent now. Or perhaps it was still there, but irrelevant. What mattered was this moment, unwritten, unremembered, but deeply known. Then the light shifted again. Behind the figure, the wall began to change the parchment-like surface, parting to reveal another passage, one narrower, curving downward. The figure across from him stood without sound. Henry remained seated. He looked at the table once more, then the shelf, then back to the open door behind him, which had quietly closed. The room had given him something, not an answer, but an echo. A small reminder. The figure waited just beyond the new passage. No words were spoken, only the quiet offer of continued company. Henry stood slower this time, but with steadier footing, and followed. The passage downward was narrower than any before, not quite claustrophobic, but undeniably intimate, as if built for conversations rather than movement. Its walls were curved and smooth, neither stone nor plaster, but something in between, a blend of surface and memory, warm to the touch, and faintly luminous, glowing with a soft golden hue that seemed to emanate from the material itself. There were no torches, no candles, no shadows. Just a consistent, quiet light, the kind one might imagine drifting through old lace hung in a sunlit window. Henry followed the figure ahead of him, still faceless, still indistinct, but now familiar in posture and pace. They moved without hurry, feet making no sound on the floor, which felt like polished wood, but offered no creak, no echo. The air grew cooler as they descended, though not unpleasantly so, more like stepping into the shade after a long afternoon in the garden. It smelled faintly of things long forgotten, dry parchment, split fruit, clean cotton. The walls did not remain the same. As they continued downward, they began to shift subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, until it became clear they were no longer walking through a fixed structure, but through something alive. The texture of the walls changed from smooth to gently grooved, like bark, softened by time and memory. Shapes began to emerge in the curves. Outlines, carvings not detailed but suggestive, a crown half buried in leaves, a child reaching toward a window, a table set for two with no chairs. Henry reached out once, let his fingers glide across one of the forms. It was cool, slightly yielding, like touching old wax or well-worn leather. As his hand passed the carving, seemed to hum beneath his palm, not with sound, but with resonance, as though recognizing him. He withdrew his hand slowly and continued. The descent did not feel steep, but steady, like walking deeper into a question. No fatigue settled in his limbs, only a soft awareness of time folding inward. He could not tell how long they walked, minutes, hours, perhaps the length of an unresolved thought. The corridor gently curved to the right, then again, creating a spiral that never seemed to repeat. At some point, the faceless figure ahead paused, turning slightly toward a small alcove that had appeared on the left side. It was barely visible, framed by two narrow columns, and half covered by a curtain of woven reeds that whispered softly, even though no wind moved through the space. The figure stepped aside, indicating without gesture that Henry should enter first. He did. The alcove was small and low-ceilinged, barely wide enough for a bench and a shelf. The bench was occupied not by a person, but by an arrangement. A folded robe, a set of gloves, a comb with two missing teeth, and a brooch shaped like a lily, the kind rarely worn, except by someone trying not to be noticed. Henry sat beside the arrangement, not touching it, but allowing its presence to settle beside him. The shelf above held only one item, a framed piece of fabric, faded and delicate, on which a few words had been embroidered in crooked stitches. He leaned forward. The words were simple, uneven, but unmistakably meant for him. You were not always wrong. He stared at them for a long time, not because they shocked him. Nothing had shocked him in quite a while, but because they felt like a door he had never seen opening into a room he'd always suspected might exist. He let the phrase settle in his chest, repeating it silently, until it no longer felt like flattery or forgiveness, but like fact. Then he stood carefully and turned back toward the passage. The figure had waited. Together, they resumed the walk downward. As they moved, the corridor changed again. The walls now bore tapestries, not woven of thread, but of light, thin sheets of shifting color that played images in slow motion. Henry saw himself young, then older, still, always from behind, or in profile, never directly. He saw places he remembered only vaguely, the edge of a battlefield at dawn, a snow-covered courtyard with no footprints, a cathedral aisle dimly lit by winter sun. He heard faint echoes, too layered beneath the silence laughter, behind a door. He never entered a lullaby, in a language he never bothered to learn, the creak of a floorboard beneath someone who walked away quietly. The tapestries flickered gently as he passed, not demanding attention, but offering it. He did not stop, but his eyes lingered on each until they faded. Then the corridor opened slowly into a wider chamber. This space was taller, airier, though still underground, its ceiling high and domed like the inside of a lantern. The center held a circular platform raised slightly and surrounded by steps, as if meant for witnessing rather than speaking. Around the edges were alcoves, each with a chair and a small stand, as though prepared for guests who had not yet arrived. The figure beside him halted at the platform's edge and turned once more to face him. Still, no face, no voice. But this time, there was something more, a presence of invitation, a pause that implied a choice. Henry looked up at the dome. It shimmered with faint constellations, slowly shifting, never repeating. Beneath them, the platform waited. He stepped onto it. As soon as his foot touched the surface, the air shifted. Not colder, not warmer. Just aware, like a page being turned. Then a voice spoke, not from the figure, not from the dome, but from the space itself. You have heard what was not said. Will you now speak what was never heard? Henry felt his chest rise, not from breath, but from memory. swelling within. He looked down at his hands. They were steady now, open. He stepped to the center of the platform, and the light around him changed, deepening to the color of thought. A soft breeze moved through the chamber, though nothing stirred. The walls did not echo. The dome above dimmed slightly, and from the farthest alcove, a second doorway began to open, not outward, but inward, folding itself into the stone with the precision of a sigh, revealing a darkness threaded with pale golden strands that moved like quiet music. The golden strands within the dark doorway pulsed gently, neither bright nor dim, but shifting in rhythm with something older than breath, older than heartbeat, a quiet cadence that seemed to wait patiently for recognition. They curved and swayed without motion, like light glimpsed through water, or memory glimpsed through sleep. Henry stood at the edge of the platform, the figure beside him, now still no longer leading, no longer waiting, only watching with the weightless gravity of something that had always known this moment would come. He took a step toward the new threshold. The air around the doorway changed warmer now, with a scent that caught at the back of his throat. Not unpleasant, just unexpected candle wax, crushed thyme. And something else, something faintly metallic, like the memory of coins, touched only in passing. He did not hesitate, not because he understood, but because something inside him had already decided to move forward. The darkness inside was not absence, but layering, textured like the pages of a book closed too long. As he entered, the golden threads shifted to one side, making space folding inward to reveal a narrow path of light woven directly into the floor, as if someone had embroidered it there with a needle made of stars. He followed it, one step at a time, aware of the way his own footsteps softened against the path, not muffled, but acknowledged, like a conversation where only one party speaks aloud. The passage ahead curved slightly downward again, never sharply, just enough to suggest that depth was not just vertical, but personal. The walls beside him were smooth, colorless in the traditional sense, but alive with soft undulations of light and shade. He did not reach out this time. He did not need to. The space around him seemed to know he was there, adjusting its texture, its silence, its shape with the subtle deference of something that remembered every dream he'd forgotten. After a time, the passage widened. Not abruptly. It simply relaxed into a space larger than before, a chamber lit from within by golden thread that now stretched not along the floor, but across the ceiling, tracing delicate loops and symbols that hinted at meaning, but offered tracing delicate loops and symbols that hinted at meaning, but offered no immediate translation, like glyphs drawn not to be read, but to be felt, to be remembered, in a way deeper than language. The golden threads crisscrossed the ceiling, like constellations, too subtle to name, and they shifted gently as Henry entered, not in movement, but in intention, as if rearranging themselves to match the shape of his presence. The chamber was round again, or almost round, its perimeter broken here and there by shallow alcoves that curved inward like the petals of a flower, not yet fully open. Each alcove contained a surface, some smooth like water, some rippled like sand, just after the tide withdraws, some dark as ink under moonlight. None reflected his face, but each offered a different kind of echo, one that vibrated softly through the soles of his shoes and into the arch of his foot, as though asking questions without words. In the center of the chamber stood another pedestal, this one lower and wider than before, topped not with a book or a bowl or a key, but with something that shimmered slightly beneath a veil of transparent fabric, like silk drawn across the surface of a still pond. Henry approached each step, matched by the hush of the room, realigning itself around him. As he reached the pedestal, the fabric shifted on its own, sliding aside with the grace of a curtain at a long closed window. Beneath it was a mirror oval, framed in wood, so pale it seemed carved from memory rather than tree. The glass was dull at first, not from dust, but from something deeper, as though it had not yet decided what to show. He leaned closer. The mirror did not show his reflection. Instead, it displayed a version of him that could have been, not younger, not older, but different, not in body, but in bearing. The man in the mirror stood straighter, not from pride, but from ease. His eyes were less guarded. His mouth held the suggestion of something unspoken, but understood. Around him was a place not quite identifiable. Part throne room, part study, part garden, but filled with the kind of quiet that grows where regrets have been acknowledged and released. Henry did not flinch. He only watched, breathing slowly, as the image shifted. Another version, now a younger self, seated at a writing desk, quill, poised, never moving the ink on the paper, refusing to dry, because no words had been committed. He recognized the moment, though he had long chosen not to recall it. A letter never written, or perhaps written and burned. The mirror offered no judgment, only continuity. Another shift. A battlefield never entered the ghost of a horse pawing at frozen ground, while men waited for a command that never came. The figures did not speak, did not fade. They remained not frozen, but paused, as if waiting to be unpaused, not by action, but by understanding. Henry raised a hand toward the mirror, but stopped before touching the glass. The surface rippled anyway, not in response, but in recognition. The mirror, it seemed, did not require contact, only attention. Another scene unfolded, this one not of him, but of someone else. A child standing in the shadow of a door, holding a small toy shaped like a bird. The child looked up, waiting, but the door never opened. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He did not know the child by name, but he knew the weight of that waiting. The mirror softened the image, fading like breath on glass. He stepped back. Around him, the chamber's alcoves began to glow more brightly, the surfaces within them pulsing gently, now more clearly discernible as different kinds of remembering. One held the shimmer of song notes suspended in light, unresolved chords, hovering just beyond hearing. Another contained motion, faint echoes of gestures, unfinished embraces, avoided doors held open and never entered. A third offered a scent strong and sudden, a particular kind of smoke from a fire lit in early winter. And with it, the memory of a conversation begun, but never finished, the words trailing off into silence, because neither party knew how to continue. Henry turned slowly in place, taking it all in the way one might survey a library where every book was unreadable, but every title still rang with personal meaning. There was no sadness here, only weight, the kind of quiet density that builds when nothing is spoken, but everything is understood. He returned to the center, to the mirror, which now displayed only light. Not bright, not blinding, just steady. As if the mirror had finished its task for now, and was simply resting like a candle still lit after the reader has gone to sleep. The golden threads along the ceiling shifted again, drawing new patterns, shapes that hinted at flight, at circles, at footsteps returning to places once left behind. From the wall directly opposite, where he had entered, a new arch began to emerge. Not with ceremony, not with light, but with the sound of a breath released. A breath not from him, but from the chamber itself. The passage it revealed was narrower than the one before, and lower its ceiling just high enough for him to pass without stooping, as though inviting intimacy rather than grandeur. The faceless figure had not reappeared, but Henry did not expect it now. This part, he understood, was meant to be walked alone. Or perhaps not alone, but with someone else, not yet visible. He stepped forward again, 1 foot on the threshold, the mirror behind him, dimming the air ahead, cooler, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves. Not wind, not weather, just the sound of presence. The arch continued to widen, revealing more of the path beyond stone steps lined with moss, low-hanging branches of trees that looked more imagined than grown, and the unmistakable sound, faint, barely there, of a voice humming a tune without melody, without words, but unmistakably meant for him. He did not speak. He did not pause. He simply walked forward as the light behind him dimmed, and the threaded dark ahead began to pulse with something slow and kind. The steps were uneven, each stone worn not by traffic, but by waiting. Moss grew thickly in the cracks, not lush or wild, but neat in a way that suggested something tended to them with patient, unseen care. Henry descended slowly, his hand brushing the cool surface of the wall beside him, which now felt more like the inside of a tree than the carved stone of earlier chambers. The air was thicker here, not heavy, but close, like the hush of a forest at dusk, when even the birds have chosen to speak more softly. The humming continued ahead, never louder, never clearer, just a steady presence, like breath exhaled between notes. It had no tune, yet it was not tuneless. It was the kind of sound that reminded him of someone working at a task not out of duty, but of rhythm. Smoothing cloth, perhaps, or tending a garden no one would see. The path curved gently to the left, then again to the right, each turn revealing more trees, though they weren't quite trees. Their trunks were tall and slender, but their bark shimmered faintly, and their leaves hung not in clusters, but in quiet constellations, each one shaped like a letter from a forgotten alphabet. They rustled without wind, their sound like paper, turned gently by fingers that didn't need to read. As he walked, the forest grew denser, not with undergrowth, but with presence, the kind that accumulates in spaces long used for reflection, where footsteps are few but remembered. Small objects appeared at intervals along the path, a half-carved whistle resting on a stone ledge, a ribbon tied to a branch too high for any child to have reached, a book left open to a blank page, its spine curved with familiarity. None of them felt abandoned. They felt paused, as if their owners had simply stepped away for a moment, intending to return shortly, and somehow never did. Henry did not touch them. He nodded once at the whistle and twice at the ribbon. The book he passed in silence, though a part of him wished he could write something in it, if only he could think of words simple enough. The path ended not in a clearing, but in a gentle, widening, where the trees gave way to a low circle of stones that had sunk slightly into the ground, as if trying not to disturb the soil too much. In the center of the circle stood a chair. It was plain wooden, with no cushion, no arms, no adornment. But it faced a large stone that rose about waist height, flat on top, and smoothed by what must have been years of elbows, hands, or resting thoughts. Behind the stone was a wall of hanging leaves, green and silver and rustling with that same unreadable softness. And in the chair, sitting quietly, with her hands folded in her lap, was the woman. The one from the garden, from the mirror, from the memory, behind the door. She was not young, not old. Her face held the calmness of someone who had stopped counting hours. Her hair was the color of morning shadows, and her eyes were the exact shade of forgetting. When Henry stepped into the circle, the humming stopped. She looked up, but did not smile. Not yet. "You made it," she said. Her voice was no louder than before, but here it touched everything. The trees paused their rustling. The stones seemed to lean slightly inward. Even the moss turned its attention in the way moss does when something important is finally being acknowledged. Henry nodded, unsure what to do with his hands. "I didn't know I was coming," he said. "But you kept walking," she replied. "That's enough." He looked around. The objects at the edge of the circle, the chair, the stone, the leaves, none of them seemed extraordinary. And yet they pressed on his chest in a way nothing had in years. He stepped forward slowly until he stood opposite her on the other side of the stone. "What is this place?" he asked. She tilted her head slightly. "This is where things wait until they can be heard." He looked at the stone. "Do I sit?" "You can," she said, "but you might want to stand first. Some things are easier to say while standing." He looked down at the moss beneath his feet, then at the sky, above which wasn't quite sky, just a pale dome threaded with silver lines, like veins in marble. He didn't sit. "What do I say?" he asked. "Whatever hasn't been," she said. Not all at once. Just let one thing begin. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He thought of his father, of the silence that stretched between them like rope taut and frayed, of the promises made to no one, of the weight of robes, of the nights spent not sleeping, not praying, just existing in the narrow space between expectation and regret. "I thought I had to be certain," he said finally. "I thought certainty made it easier for others to follow." She nodded. And it did. For a while, but I wasn't sure, he said. Not really. Most people aren't, she replied. He looked at her, then fully, not as a memory, not as a dream, but as someone who had waited long enough to deserve the truth. I hurt people, he said. Sometimes, for reasons I thought were right. Sometimes, just because I could. She did not flinch. And now, he shook his head. Now I think, maybe I should have listened more. She leaned slightly forward. You still can. He glanced down at the stone between them. Is that what this is for? It remembers things, she said. Things you didn't hear. Things you weren't ready to. Will it speak them only if you're still? He was. The moss softened further beneath his feet. The leaves behind her began to shift, revealing just faintly a glimmer of something more, another passage, perhaps, or a garden that hadn't yet bloomed. He didn't look at it. He looked at her. Did you wait long? He asked. Her answer was so quiet, he wasn't sure it was spoken. Only until you asked. And with that, the first word from the stone began to rise. Not in sound, not in image, but in weight. It drifted upward like dust in light, settling first into the quiet between them, and then into the hollow space just behind his sternum, where silence had always lived. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply listened. The word was not a word, as Henry knew them, not one with letters or syllables or a place in dictionaries, but a shape that filled the hollow places inside his memory, like warm air seeping through cracks in winter. It did not speak to his ears, but to the weight between his ribs, that quiet chamber where unspoken thoughts often nested. He stood completely still, arms at his sides, and let the word settle, not trying to understand it, but allowing it to understand him. The woman across the stone watched without speaking, her expression unchanged, but softened around the edges, as if the act of listening was a kind of work she was familiar with and willing to do indefinitely. The moss underfoot thickened, not rising, but deepening, becoming less a surface and more a cushion, as though the earth itself wanted to help absorb what was being said, even if nothing had been spoken. Another word rose from the stone. This one felt older somehow, scratched at the edges, like a lesson learned before it could be written down. It curled through the space like wood smoke, faint and grounding, bringing with it a memory Henry hadn't invited, but could not turn away from a pair of hands folded behind a back, pacing before a fire. The tightness in his own jaw as he listened to praise disguised as pressure. The moment he realized he would inherit not just a crown, but the shape of someone else's silence. He breathed out slowly, the exhale lung and steady. The stone continued. Each word or presence or offering rose with such care that Henry began to wonder if the stone itself was choosing them, selecting from a long list of what had been held back, not in cruelty, but in patience. They came without hurry. A glance never returned. A prayer never answered, a truth avoided, because it was too small to matter until it wasn't. With each one, Henry felt something shift, not fall away exactly, but move, like rearranging furniture in a room, long untouched. Nothing removed, nothing added, only seen anew. He looked once at the woman. Her gaze did not waver, but there was a light behind it now. Not brightness, but presence, the kind of quiet clarity that comes after a storm no one else noticed. "Is this forgiveness?" he asked, not expecting an answer. She tilted her head slightly. "No. This is before forgiveness. This is where forgetting begins to loosen." He nodded, though the truth of it arrived slowly, like a letter slipped under a door long after the knock. Another word surfaced. This one was heavier, shaped like a hand held too long in parting. He did not remember who it belonged to, only that it had been warm and unwilling. He lowered his head slightly, not in grief, but in gratitude. The forest leaned in, not visibly, not tangibly, but the air thickened with the closeness of listening things, of unseen branches drawing breath. He could feel them just beyond sight, attending not to him, but to the space being cleared, the way dust listens to broom bristles. The stone pulsed again. The next offering came with a scent salt and rain sea air in early spring. He saw a ship, a harbor, someone standing with one foot on the dock and the other on the deck, hesitating. He saw himself watching, not speaking. The figure sailed anyway. The moment passed. "I could have gone," he said softly. The woman nodded. "You could have, but you didn't. I thought they needed me here, and maybe they did." But the silence noticed. He sat then slowly on the moss. The earth beneath yielded without resistance, becoming a kind of cradle. The stone was just at eye level now. He reached out, let his fingers rest on its surface. It was warm, but not like sun-warmed rock. Warm, like breath, like closeness. The next image came without prompting. A corridor, 2 guards, a door, that closed too loudly, and behind it, a face he chose to forget before it could become too familiar. "I didn't want to," he said, "but I believed I had to." The stone gave no reply. It only offered another shape, this one lighter, almost playful. A laugh shared beneath a table. Too much wine, a slip of the tongue that became a shared joke for a week, and then was never mentioned again. He smiled just barely. The woman across from him mirrored it, but said nothing. The leaves behind her shimmered faintly, catching a breeze that wasn't there, each one glowing like a small lantern strung between yesterday and not quite yet. Henry closed his eyes. He let the next word arrive without bracing for it. It was a name, not one he had said aloud in decades, not one he had dared to remember with kindness, but the name came anyway, soft and unfinished, spoken, not by him, but into him. And this time he answered it, not aloud, but fully. The moss thickened again. The light overhead turned the shade of paper before it's written on. He did not open his eyes right away. He let the name sit, expand, dissolve. When he did open them, the woman was no longer watching him. Her gaze had shifted to the wall of leaves behind her, which now parted slowly, revealing another passage, narrow and sloping, slightly upward, its floor dappled with gray light, like sunlight filtered through memory. She stood without hurry. He remained seated. She did not beckon, but her pause invited. The stone beneath his hand cooled slightly, not withdrawing, only pausing the way a storyteller might pause at a chapter's edge to see if the listener is ready. Henry stood slowly, bones creaking, with the kind of tiredness that comes not from effort, but from honesty. He looked once more at the stone. "Will it still be here?" he asked. The woman nodded. "Always. For those willing to hear before they speak." And then, without fanfare, she turned and stepped into the light that filtered through the parted leaves. Henry followed one foot, brushing against the edge of moss. The other, landing on stone bathed in memory's glow. Behind him, the stone quieted. Ahead, the light tilted. The path began to climb. The stone beneath his feet was smoother now, less worn, and more intentional, like it had been laid not by hands, but by time itself, gently placing each slab to receive the weight of those who chose to walk without running. The climb was not steep, but it required attention, as though the path expected its travelers to carry their weight differently after what they had just heard. Henry ascended slowly, following the woman, who moved ahead with a calm surety, her steps leaving no trace but seeming to remind the path it was being honored. The air grew lighter with each step, not in brightness, but in substance, as if the very space around him was thinning to allow more room for thought to stretch. The walls, on either side, faded gradually into arching trees, again, their leaves trembling, not from wind but from memory, dislodged gently by passing footsteps. Overhead, the branches formed a canopy that filtered light like lace patches of golden warmth, falling irregularly, shifting with each breath of the world around them. Somewhere nearby, unseen birds sang not songs, but syllables, as though practicing language in fragments too soft to be understood. With each step, Henry felt something returning to him, not youth, not vigor, but a kind of quiet readiness, like a field tilled patiently and finally left to rest. The woman ahead slowed as the path straightened, and soon they arrived at a wide landing framed by two tall stones that curved inward at the top, forming an arch without a door. Beneath it stood a loom. It was large and old, though not decaying its wooden frame, darkened by age, and handled often by unseen fingers. The threads stretched taut across it were golden, like the ones that had lit the ceiling of the chamber below. But now they shimmered with hints of other colors, soft greens, pale blues, even shades of gray that caught the light like silver smoke. The loom worked itself. Its shuttle moved slowly back and forth, drawing patterns into a fabric that curled downward into a large pile at its base, a tapestry in progress so vast it seemed impossible to have been made from a single life. Yet somehow Henry knew it was his. The woman did not speak. She stood beside the loom, her eyes watching not the shuttle, but the empty threads still waiting to be woven. Henry stepped closer, compelled not by curiosity, but by recognition. The threads pulsed, faintly, some tight, others slack. He saw sections of the tapestry already formed, moments he remembered, some clearly, some only as feelings. The heavy silence of a crown lowered onto his head, the thrill of galloping through open fields before obligation caught up the weight of a child's gaze. He did not meet the shape of a door closed too early, a conversation not begun. And alongside these were other patterns, ones he didn't recognize. Images not lived, but imagined loops of what might have been meals shared, instead of dismissed letters delivered instead of burned hands held a moment longer. He stared, heart steady, as the shuttle wove another line, this time of pale thread that glimmered faintly with violet. I thought my story was already finished, he said, watching the fabric shift. It's not your story, the woman replied. It's your remembering. And it continues for as long as you're willing to see it. He nodded. Will I weave more? You already are. He reached toward the loom. The shuttle paused. The threads hummed gently. His fingers hovered just above them, and the tapestry shimmered with a new pattern. 3 small figures standing in a garden, one of them laughing with their head thrown back. The sound carried upward into branches that bent slightly to listen. He did not know their names, but he knew the shape of that laughter. It was his once, or could have been. He let his hand fall to his side. I never knew what to do with silence, he said. I thought speaking filled it, but sometimes I only made it louder. The woman placed one hand lightly on the loom's frame. Silence isn't absence, she said. It's space. It becomes what you bring to it. The shuttle began moving again, slow and steady. Henry watched as a new thread, one of deep green, was drawn into the weave, connecting a pattern of jagged lines to a soft, spiraling curve. What's that? He asked. Regret meeting understanding, she said. They don't cancel each other. They settle together. A breeze moved across the platform, lifting the edge of the tapestry and carrying it slightly toward him. He reached out and caught it, not roughly, but with care, and it folded easily into his hands, like fabric that had been waiting to be held. It was heavier than it looked, but not burdensome. Its weight was honest. He folded it once, then laid it back down gently. The loom paused again. The woman turned toward him. There's more ahead, she said. He glanced at the arch behind the loom. A narrow path led forward this time, flanked by tall grasses, swaying in rhythm to something unplayed. Will it be harder? He asked. Not harder, she said, but closer. He didn't ask what she meant. The path was already unfolding, and his feet were ready. He stepped past the loom, past the edge of what had been woven, and into the swaying hush of the tall grass. Each blade whispered as he passed 1,000 small voices, not calling, but recalling. The wind carried no chill, only the quiet insistence of things long planted beginning to stir. Ahead, the light deepened. The air changed again, and the path began to narrow. The tall grasses leaned inward the farther Henry walked, not to obstruct, but to guide their gentle brush against his arms and legs, more reminiscent of a gesture than a force. Each step carried him deeper into a space where time folded so softly it could not be felt, only observed in the subtle changes of light and scent. The air here was infused with something faintly herbal, something like sage left too long in a wooden drawer, mixed with the sharp clarity of cold water poured from a clay jug. The wind, though light, carried with it a rhythm that matched his breath without effort, as if the world was exhaling just as he did. The path beneath his feet had become earthen again, packed firm with countless quiet treadings, its edges lined with small stones, some smooth, others chipped, as though each had been touched or turned by someone whose name Henry had once known, but never said. The grasses thinned just ahead, revealing a meadow so still it looked paused. The clearing was round, gently sunken into the land, its floor covered in moss and low flowers that did not bloom in unison, but in quiet, staggered patterns. Some petals were tightly closed, others open only halfway, as if testing the light. And in the center of the meadow was a table not of wood or stone, but something in between, a material that shimmered slightly when viewed from the side, but remained matte from above. Around the table were chairs, 12 to be exact. All different, none elaborate, each one the sort of seat someone might use in a moment of thought rather than power. Henry did not approach at first. He stood at the edge of the meadow and listened. There was no bird song, no rustle of branches, only the soft sound of petals shifting direction and the occasional creak of the grasses adjusting their attention. Then he saw them, the names, not carved, not written, but resting on the chairs like folded napkins or freshly picked fruit. Each name was whole without embellishment. Names he had spoken, names he had avoided, names he had tried to forget, but never fully released. He stepped closer. The first chair bore the name of his mother, not her title, not her position, just her name, the one whispered in doorways when he was small and too feverish to answer. The second held the name of a friend he'd once raced on horseback through a shallow stream, laughing so hard the reins slipped from his hands, and he never told anyone how good it felt to lose on purpose. The third was heavier, a name he had only shouted once, and never in kindness. The fourth was unreadable, not because it was smudged, but because it was never said aloud, a presence he'd chosen to ignore until they disappeared behind a door he never opened. He moved slowly, reading each name without touching, letting the shape of each settle in his mind like stones in water, stirring soft ripples of memory, not sharp enough to wound, but deep enough to hold. Some names he mouthed silently. Others he dared not try. One name caught his breath, a name he had called out once in sleep and denied in daylight, a name that had waited long in the quiet corners of corridors where he never lingered. He reached for that name, not to lift it, but to rest his hand beside it. The air around the table seemed to pulse not in movement, but in attention. None of the chairs were occupied, yet none felt empty. He circled the table once. Each step brought a shift in the meadow's light. Shadows lengthened gently behind flowers. The grasses at the edge bent a little farther forward, as if leaning in to hear what was not being said. Then, at the 12th chair, he paused. No name rested on this one. Instead, the chair itself was made of many pieces, each one carved from a different type of wood. Elm, yew oak, ash birch, and one piece in a strange silvery bark that caught the light like dew. The seat was worn smooth at the edges, not by time alone, but by intention. He sat. The table before him shimmered faintly, the surface becoming more reflective, not like a mirror, but like water, waiting for something to ripple across it. Across the table, the other chairs remained still, the names untouched. Yet Henry felt them begin to shift, not physically, but within him, each one nudging a corner of memory, each one offering a version of a moment he'd lived but never truly entered. A voice, not the woman's, not his own, began to speak, not aloud, but through the rhythm of light and shadow on the table's surface. It said, quite simply, "Now listen as they did." And then the names began to speak, not in sequence, not in unison. They spoke like leaves falling at their own pace, each one carried by a different breeze. They spoke of meals half shared and glances misunderstood. They spoke of days when Henry stood too far away, and nights when he stood too close without seeing. They spoke not in blame, but in remembering, in the quiet honesty that lives in those who have waited without hope, but not without care. He closed his eyes. Each name pressed gently against his thoughts, not to demand, but to remind. He saw his own hands, sometimes open, sometimes clenched. He saw doorways, both passed through and avoided. He saw a mirror he'd once covered, afraid of what might stare back. And beneath it all, he heard a sound, steady, familiar. The shuttle of the loom, still weaving somewhere behind him, threading these names, these moments into the tapestry of his continued memory. The table quieted. The light shifted. A path of stones began to form at the far end of the meadow, small at first, then clear. It curved gently upward into another line of trees, just beginning to glow with the blue tint of twilight. Henry rose, steadied by the chair that still held no name. He looked once more around the table, then at the path ahead. The grasses waited, and the next step began. The stones that marked the path ahead were not laid in strict alignment, but scattered with the care of someone arranging pieces for a story yet to be told, each one smooth and flat, as if shaped by countless moments of indecision, finally given form. As Henry stepped away from the table, the names behind him did not fade, nor did they follow. They remained quietly where they had always been, present, unforgotten, and for now, at rest. The path curved upward into the trees, which had grown tall and thin. Their trunks so straight they resembled quills, and their bark bore lines like faded handwriting, stretched too long in the sun. The leaves here were thinner than parchment, almost translucent, and they fluttered lightly at his passage, not stirred by wind, but by proximity, each one reacting not to his body, but to the thoughts that pressed gently behind his eyes. The light that filtered through them had cooled to a waved indigo, not dark, but calming in its restraint, like the moment just before a lantern is lit. Henry followed the path without haste, each step placed with the deliberation of someone remembering how to walk after a long time standing still. The air smelled faintly of stone, warmed by twilight, and somewhere far off, the echo of distant chimes played a rhythm too slow to be called a song. The silence here was not emptiness. It was space, a patient invitation for breath and thought to unfold in equal measure. As he moved farther into the trees, he began to notice small lanterns set into the ground along the path. Each one was different in shape, some round, others square, some shaped like bells or folded leaves, but all of them contained the same quiet glow, not from flame, but from something softer, like the remembered warmth of a hand once held too briefly. He paused at one of the lanterns and bent slightly to look inside. It held no wick, no fuel, only a shimmer that moved when he breathed near it, like it was listening. He stood again and continued. The path rose steadily, though not steeply, and the forest began to thin. In the gaps between the trees, he could see glimpses of sky deepening now to a rich cobalt, flecked with the first faint pinpricks of stars, not arranged in constellations, but in meandering paths that seemed to follow the curves of the land below, rather than the heavens above. Eventually, the path leveled out and brought him to another clearing, this one smaller than the meadow of names, and enclosed on 3 sides by low stone walls overgrown with ivy that shimmered faintly in the blue dusk. In the center of the clearing was a basin, shallow, circular, carved from the same soft-colored stone as the arch he had passed beneath at the loom. The basin was empty, but beside it sat a pitcher also of stone, and a cloth folded neatly on its rim. There was no one else here, but Henry felt no solitude. The space carried the same presence as a chapel left open after sundown, expectant quiet, not sacred in declaration, but in use. He approached the basin and looked down. Its interior was etched with a spiral that drew inward, not tightly, but with the ease of a river bending through flat land. The pitcher beside it was light when he lifted it, though full, and when he poured the water into the basin, it flowed silently, not splashing, but settling with the gravity of memory being acknowledged. The water stilled quickly, and in its surface he did not see his face, but the path behind him, each place he had passed, each silence he had met, each word that had risen from the listening stone. They did not replay as images, but as sensations layered softly beneath the quiet surface. The tension in his chest, in the room of unopened doors, the ache in his legs, from the descent through the remembering passage, the warmth that had pulsed beneath his palm at the center of the platform. Then, as he looked deeper, he began to see something else. Not past, not future, but a space that curved gently inward, like the pocket inside a well-worn coat, where one might keep a letter not yet read. A space that waited. The cloth beside the basin stirred slightly in the breeze that hadn't existed until now. He picked it up and held it uncertain of its use until the basin's surface shimmered and the water began to ripple outward in slow circles. He understood then that the cloth was not for drying, but for holding. Gently, he dipped the cloth into the basin and then wrung it out above the stone. The water that fell did not return to the basin, but soaked into the stone itself, which darkened slightly in acceptance. He repeated the motion slowly, 3 times. Each time, the water seemed to carry with it something not quite remembered, an apology, not spoken, a gesture not completed, a decision paused too long. When he finished, the cloth felt heavier, not with moisture, but with meaning. He folded it once more and set it back where it had been. The basin was now dry, though the water had not spilled. He stood in silence for a few moments longer, feeling the air shift gently around him, as though the trees themselves were breathing a little easier now. Then, just beyond the ivy wall, another path began to light faint golden lines, marking the edges, curving not downward or upward, but outward, as if leading into a space neither within nor beyond. Henry stepped forward. He did not look back at the basin, though he felt its presence remain with him, like the aftertaste of something once sweet and only slightly bitter. The golden path ahead shimmered with the softness of a thread laid across fabric, ready to be pulled gently through the weave. He followed it, and the trees behind him did not close, but waited. The golden path unfolded beneath Henry's feet, not as a road, but as a suggestion, the way a ribbon laid across tall grass might guide the eye rather than the step. It did not shine brightly, nor did it dim, but pulsed with a quiet rhythm, not unlike the loom's shuttle from earlier. A pulse that spoke not of urgency, but of continuity, of something carefully unwinding in time with his breath. The trees receded gently behind him, their trunks bowing inward with the grace of farewell, their leaves falling upward rather than down, drifting into the twilight sky where they dissolved like sighs. The air along this path was cooler, but not cold, and it smelled faintly of linen, dried in sunlight, and books whose pages had been turned slowly. Ahead, the terrain softened into long, even slopes covered in low grass that rustled like silk when brushed by ankles. The path wove without haste, curving left then right, occasionally vanishing beneath patches of shadow, only to reappear again a few steps farther on, as if playing a game with those willing to follow it past the edges of what was certain. At times, the golden line would break into threads, diverging into 2 or 3 short spurs that each dissolved into nothing if followed more than a few steps, as though offering glimpses of options never taken, a quiet reminder of how many almosts had carried weight in silence. As he walked, Henry began to notice shapes emerging along the edge of the path, not objects, not people, but imprints, like memories that had decided to live just beneath the surface of the present moment. One took the form of a garden bench carved with initials he almost recognized. Another resembled a corridor whose end curved away just before it could be seen. There was a window with no wall through which he saw a feast set for 7 and a single chair pulled too far back to suggest arrival. None of it startled him. None of it asked anything of him. They were simply there, as if the path had chosen now to reveal not what had been, but what had once leaned close to becoming. He passed a lantern hanging from nothing, its light dim but constant, and beneath it lay a pair of gloves folded carefully over a note with no words. A step farther on, the wind shifted slightly and brought with it a song so familiar he could not tell if he had heard it as a child or invented it during one of those long, half-woken nights when dreams murmur close but refuse to finish. The path widened slightly, then opening into a space neither forest nor field, enclosed only by the sound of breath exhaled through tall grass. At the center of this space stood a frame, tall, arching, without door or curtain, made of silver wood and thread. Its top woven with quiet precision into a shape reminiscent of a question mark drawn by someone hesitant to ask. Within the frame, there was nothing. No wall, no screen, no shimmering curtain of light. Only a stillness that felt less like emptiness and more like readiness. Henry approached the golden thread curling gently around the base of the arch, as if laying a quiet offering at its foot. He stood before the frame and did not step through. He waited, and the air around him shifted, not warmer, not colder, just more aware, as though the space itself was considering him. Then a voice, not spoken, not sung, not even truly heard, came into him, like breath drawn in reverse. You are not at the end. You are at the place where choosing becomes remembering. He closed his eyes. The thread beneath his feet pulsed once. The frame remained silent. But the world behind it began to whisper, not in words, but in shapes. He saw a road with 3 forks, each leading to a version of the same town, each town filled with someone who once waited at a window until they no longer did. He saw a quill laid beside a page half filled, and next to it a candle that had burned down without ever being lit. He saw a crown placed gently onto a pillow, not claimed, not refused. Then, without transition, he saw himself not as he had been, not as others had known him, but as a pattern, a looping weave of choices, gestures, silences, and sudden laughter. The pattern shimmered, and then it turned. Behind the frame, a wall began to shape itself, not of stone, but of time. Soft curves emerged, carrying outlines of things once waited for and never arrived. A cup held out, but not filled. A letter sent, but never returned. A touch withdrawn at the last moment, not out of reluctance, but of fear it would be misunderstood. Henry stepped forward, then not through the frame, but beside it, along the edge of the golden thread that now split again. This time, not dissolving, but braiding. One path continued forward, curving gently toward a rise in the land that shimmered faintly with violet light. Another curved back toward a place that looked familiar, not because he had seen it, but because he had never forgotten it entirely. A door painted the color of dried rosemary, a chair with one leg slightly shorter, and the soft sound of someone setting down a book just before sleep. He paused. Both paths pulsed faintly, neither demanding. The voice within him returned quieter now. Some things become real only when you walk toward them a second time. He breathed in the air cool against his throat. He did not choose yet. He only stood, allowing the moment to lengthen, to soften, to prepare. Behind him, the frame dimmed slightly, and the golden thread beneath his feet waited, not pulling, not retreating, only holding steady. Ahead, the violet shimmer began to move not forward, but inward. And from somewhere, just beyond the rise, a familiar voice hummed again this time, carrying the shape of a name not yet spoken. Henry took the first step toward the shimmer, the golden thread tightening beneath his feet, not in resistance, but as if bracing to hold him gently, like an old friend, preparing to walk beside him again after a long separation. The path curved slowly upward, its edges soft with moss that didn't crush underfoot, but instead yielded with a kind of memory, as if each step he took pressed lightly into the recollection of 1,000 other moments, all stacked together like pages in a book, half written. The sky overhead deepened as he climbed, fading from twilight, cobalt, into a soft wash of violet, so pale it felt like the inside of a thought rather than a color. Stars blinked lazily above him, not arranged in constellations, but in the vague shape of pauses, moments in time where someone had once hesitated before speaking and never quite resumed. The humming voice that had brushed the air earlier returned still wordless, but now closer, threading itself into the breeze like the hem of a cloak, just barely brushing the grass. As he ascended the slope, widened again into a long ridge, and from its crest he could finally see what lay beyond a gentle valley, bathed entirely in violet light, not from any visible source, but from the land itself. The grass here glowed faintly, as if lit from within by the same quiet understanding that had guided every step of his journey. Scattered throughout the valley were shapes, some clear, some indistinct, like memories suspended just before they chose their final form. One resembled the frame from earlier, though smaller, and made of woven reeds. Another looked like a child's bed, with a single toy nestled at its foot. There was a bench shaped like a question mark, and beside it, a teacup resting on a stone still steaming, though no hand had touched it in years. These were not dreams, not visions, but fragments, the kinds of moments that often arrive just before sleep, half remembered and rarely pursued. Henry did not need to touch them to know what they were. He walked among them, slowly, respectfully, like moving through a quiet room filled with people choosing not to speak. The air in the valley had changed, thickened, not with heaviness, but with possibility, like the feeling just before a door opens or a curtain lifts that moment when everything could still unfold differently, if only you stepped with enough intention. In the center of the valley was a circle of low stones, and at its center a pool still and round, and so perfectly calm it did not reflect the sky above, but something deeper, something beneath even memory. The voice, now just a few steps ahead, paused, not as if lost, but as if waiting for him to reach a place where listening could truly begin. He approached the pool. The stones around it were warm to the touch, though he hadn't touched them. He could feel their warmth through the soles of his shoes, a slow heat, like the kind left behind on a chair. Someone just vacated the gentle imprint of presence. When he looked into the pool, he saw not himself, but a room, small, warmly lit, a chair beside a fire, a book open on the floor, as if it had slipped gently from a resting hand. The room was familiar, but not his. It was a room that had been offered once long ago and declined without thought. He leaned closer. The room flickered, shifted, and now showed another space, a hallway filled with paintings turned to the wall, their backs coated in dust, each frame slightly crooked, as if unsure how to hang without being seen. He recognized none of them, but felt them all the same. They were pieces of the people who had passed through his life without leaving marks he thought to name. The humming resumed again this time, not ahead, but behind. He turned. The woman had returned, the same one who had met him at the loom, and the basin, her expression unchanged, but her presence deepened, as if something had resolved in her that no longer needed language. She did not speak. Instead, she held out her hand. In it was a thread, not golden, not silver, but violet, matching the valley's glow, spun so finely it shimmered even when still. He stepped forward and took it. It was warm and soft and surprisingly heavy. "This is yours," she said finally, "but it isn't for keeping. It's for placing." He nodded, though he didn't yet know what she meant. The thread pulsed slightly in his hand, as though acknowledging its own purpose before revealing it. She stepped aside, and beyond her, a low wall became visible, circular, like a well, but shallower and wider, with 12 notches carved into its rim. 11 of them were already filled with threads, each a different shade, each coiled in gentle spirals that shimmered faintly. Only one notch remained open. He approached. The violet thread in his hand pulsed again. He looked down at the space, then back at the valley. The shapes were beginning to fade, not disappearing, but softening into mist, as if their time to be observed had passed. The pool behind him stilled again, reflecting now only the sky, which had grown darker still, though not with night. It was a darkness that felt like velvet, comforting and without edge. The stars above continued their slow drift, one by one, beginning to settle into patterns he could almost name. He turned back to the wall. The final notch waited. He raised the thread. It shimmered once more brighter now, and he leaned forward, but he did not place it yet. His hand hovered. Something in the air shifted again, just to his left. A new voice emerged, soft and small, and shaped like a question, not yet dared. And he turned the thread, still in hand, as the voice grew clearer. Not louder, just closer. And it spoke his name. Henry stood perfectly still, the violet thread held gently in his hand, the final notch before him, waiting in a silence so complete it felt like the moment between a breath drawn and one finally let go. The voice that had spoken his name was not booming, not distant, not even especially distinct. It was quiet, hesitant, like the voice of someone who rarely used it aloud, someone who called, not because they expected to be heard, but because they hoped. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the violet-lit valley that had begun to shimmer faintly at its edges, as if the light itself was growing softer with the passage of realization. No figure stood there, no shape waited in the shadows, but the presence remained warm and steady, like a hand resting lightly on the edge of memory. The voice repeated his name once more this time, with a touch more clarity, as if emboldened, not by confidence, but by care. Henry stepped away from the well. The violet thread still resting loosely in his hand, trailing just slightly, like the tail of a comet, reluctant to vanish. The air was thicker here now, not heavy, but full dense with the weight of things that had waited a long time to be heard, but longer still to be trusted. He took another step. The valley responded, not with sound or motion, but with a slow deepening of light, the violet hue darkening to a rich, near indigo glow that illuminated the mist without dispersing it like moonlight through linen curtains. The shapes he had passed earlier, the bench, the bed, the steaming cup remained faint, blurred around their edges, their significance unspoken, but undeniable. And then, between two of those softened outlines, the air seemed to fold inward, like a letter being carefully opened. A figure began to emerge, not dramatically, not all at once. First, the shape of shoulders slightly hunched in the way of someone used to waiting. Then the outline of hands, one clasped in the other, fidgeting, not nervously, but thoughtfully. Finally, a face, not young, not old, but marked gently with the lines of someone who had watched many doors open and close without stepping through. Their eyes met his. They didn't smile. They didn't weep. They only looked at him. And in that look, Henry saw something he hadn't allowed himself to carry for longer than he could remember recognition. Not of name or role or past offense, but of sameness, of shared pauses, of choices made not with malice, but with caution. The figure stepped closer. The voice returned now clearly. Theirs. "I waited," they said. "I know," Henry replied. They looked down at the thread in his hand. "You brought it here." "It brought me," he said. The figure nodded, then reached out not to take, but to touch. Their fingers brushed the thread with reverence, and it shimmered in response, not bright, but true, the way a candle flickers not from wind, but from attention. "It's not meant to be kept," the figure said. "No, it's not meant to be forgotten either." Henry shook his head. "It's meant to be placed." Together, without speaking again, they turned and walked side by side toward the well. The path behind them remained clear, the mist folding gently around their footprints, as if eager to preserve the weight of that return. When they reached the final notch, the figure did not step back. They stood beside him, hands still clasped, eyes still watching. Henry raised the thread once more. It pulsed steady now, no longer hesitant. The notch received it like a breath taken in no fanfare, no burst of light, just a quiet settling, a final stitch in a tapestry that had waited not for completion, but for acknowledgement. The thread coiled slowly into place, its glow merging with the others, until the circle of the well shimmered softly, a wheel of moments bound not by order, but by recognition. The well remained unchanged in structure, but its presence deepened. Henry could feel its center, now not as a void, but as a fullness too complete to describe a space where all the almosts, the maybes, the might-have-beens now simply were. He exhaled. The figure beside him finally smiled, not wide, not gleaming just enough to shift the lines of their face into something open. They did not speak again, and they did not stay. With a gentle incline of the head, they stepped back into the mist, their shape dissolving not in disappearance, but in return. Henry remained. The valley was still. The light, now a steady blue-violet, began to stretch upward, curling into the sky, like a rising song without melody. Behind him, the golden path began to unwind, not retreating, but revealing. It now looped gently toward a new space, not familiar, not foretold, just waiting. He turned toward it. His hands were empty. The thread had been given. The voice had been heard. And ahead, the next path did not shimmer. It pulsed, not brightly, but steadily, as though finally ready to become whatever was walked upon it.